culture was old, but it was new to the European. And he soon came to think of himself as a new Adam, born in another Eden, with a new chance for paradise right here, the shore of the new world. He exterminated the old Adam, the Indian, and took his place in Eden. But as the years went on, and especially after the Civil War, the American, the triumphant Adam, was not so sure that he had not already spoiled Eden, crushing it under the weight of men, money, and machines. He felt a need to look back into his own past and into that of all human civilizations. Out of that impulse, the Metropolitan Museum of Art came into being. American artists played a large part in its foundation. And from the very beginning of its history, their works held an important place in its great collections of the arts of all the ages from all over the world. Now they're gathered together here in the new quarters of the American Wing.
Architecture in the period rooms, furniture, sculpture, and painting from the colonial period to about 1914. And they can be seen in close proximity to the galleries of European art, from which, in the beginning, they derived. But for an American, a visit to the American Wing is a journey of discovery into the self. I'm Vincent Scully. I teach at Yale. For me, the whole history of art is a delight and a wonder. It teaches me personally more about human history than I can learn in any other way. In these two programs, I'd like to be talking about American art, from the beginning up until World War I. American art doesn't stop there, far from it. But that period does make sense when it's considered as a unit, and it's the one that's represented in the American Wing. American art is, of course, the closest and most informative of all. But it's no less mysterious for that. Its history is a curious one. It starts afresh on a new continent, but with old memories. So that from the very beginning, it has been haunted more than most other arts have been by the hard question of what is real. It keeps asking that question. It's still asking it, still inexhaustibly fresh and inquiring. To know it, we should start at its beginning, with the first kind of architectural environment for human beings that it created on these shores. And the Hart Room in the Metropolitan is a good place for us to begin. Let's do it. Here in the Hart Room, we can see what the earliest architecture in New England was like. And it was a basic architecture, founded on basic needs. The first one was fire. It's cold in New England. So the fire created an enormous hearth, the very center of the house. And the hearth was embedded in a great chimney mass. And that chimney stabilized the rest of the structure, which was a wooden frame. And that frame, which is all carried here on the great so-called summer beam, which runs from the fireplace mass out to the girt on the outside wall, which is bending there under the weight. And the beam itself, you can see, is deflecting from the weight it's been carrying over the centuries. It's just high enough to stand under, and the room is lighted by very small casement windows. So the effect is quite dark and protective. It's protective and warm in a thermal sense, but it's psychologically protective as well. And it creates an image which somehow never seems quite to die out of the American consciousness. It's revived several times, and its memory haunts the American spirit from that time onward.
The exterior of such houses is closed tightly against the climate. English late medieval middle-class architecture is systematized and regularized in the colonies, as here, for example, in the Parson Capen House in Topsfield, Massachusetts. It becomes very much the recreation of a colonial craftsman culture. There's a central fireplace mass, there's a skeleton structure around it, and the rooms that are created by this order are low and comparatively dark. In those low, dark interiors, painting played a minimal part. Silver was the major object of pride. It might be argued that silver is the ideal Puritan art. It's first of all a possession, and that preoccupation with owning an object, which is also the money of the household, is perfectly embodied in silver. There's also the linearity, the coolness, the self-control of silver, thin and ringing, so different from the dull papist gleam of gold. There's something that transcends the flesh about silver. All of these qualities must have appealed very much to the Puritan mentality.
It's when you see the silver displayed in the house that you begin to feel its true importance. It's set out on great cupboards, which are almost as high as the room. Massive, monumental, aggressive pieces of furniture that fill the space. And then on top of them, and sometimes in front of them, the silver gleams, intense, giving off light above the dark cupboard. And with the two together, you begin to feel that American sanctification of the house as the center of ritual, which again never leaves the American consciousness in later ages.
You can feel how objects of furniture like these can be powerful forces to dominate a small room. Some of the most important objects were chairs. One early type was the turned great chair, like this one from eastern Massachusetts, the Brewster type. It's put together like the frame structure that makes the house. It's an environment inhabited by a person. Then with the shift to so-called William and Mary design, you begin to feel the chair itself as embodying the person who sits in it. The arm itself, as it turns over, makes you feel the sitter.
Then with Queen Anne furniture, around 1725, the whole chair becomes an active creature. The arms curve over and down, the splat lifts and gestures behind them, the back with a wonderfully controlled curve comes down and transmits its energies into the seat, which then transmits them to the legs, which are cabrio legs, and therefore they bend, they crouch, and they end in feet, so that the whole chair becomes a kind of animal. But indeed, it's a person, because it embodies the act of the human sitter. It is the figural sculpture of the colonial interior, and it's one which brings a kind of household divinity, a household god, into the room. It's just at that moment of rather marvelous sculptural life in the Queen Anne furniture in the 1740s that what I think we can call the first American painting appears. And that's the painting of Robert Feake, as in his portrait of Tench Francis. Feake, of course, like all colonial painters, owes a lot to the English portrait tradition.
But if you compare him with an Englishman painting in the colonies, John Smibert, as in Smibert's portrait of Francis Brinley, the difference is enormous. Smibert is much looser, not nearly as strong, not nearly as taut.
You feel that Feake has grown out of the craftsman tradition of the colonies, and that in his painting, for the first time, the elegance, the tautness, the beautifully made quality of the Queen Anne, indeed its sculptural stance, is brought into painting. With Feake, the tradition is that he was a tailor, so that when he paints those clothes, he knows exactly how they're put together, and he paints them lovingly with a craftsman tailor's eye for their detail, for the way the buttons are put in, for the sheen of the waistcoat, for the shape of the pocket unbuttoned, casting a shadow on the buttons underneath it, for the white stock against which the rather somber, beautifully dressed harmonies of brown and black and lavender play off. It's almost Spanish elegance, almost like Velázquez, as is the pride of the figure. But it's really here a craftsman's pride. And it's a pride in those clothes, in those possessions, And that remains a very American pride throughout our history. Much later, Theodore Dreiser was to say that clothes, along with women and money, were a major way in which Americans identified themselves. Being a classless society, they had no titles. So it's how you look, it's your clothes. It's the 1940s and 50s sharkskin suit, the American businessman in his taut, neat, hard coat. But here, in the beginning, with Feek, there's a real kind of purity in that love of possession. It shines out of the picture, and it gives Feek that special kind of integrity, that light that comes off him, like the light off the silver, in which you feel the pride of the colonial craftsman culture, wholly embodied in the forms.
What Feek does is a lot like what happens to a kind of chair which becomes peculiarly American. That's the Windsor chair. It starts in England, but English Windsor chairs are grossly constructed objects when they're compared to the beautifully crafted, very light, tensile, skeletal structures that the American Windsor chairs become. Or if we take chess, this early highboy is lifted heavily upon many legs. All the compression is weighing down upon them. The mass is subsiding, drooping a little.
Then this Queen Anne chess hoists itself up, stands on its legs like a person by Feek. Frontal, beautifully dressed, wonderful sheen. Its brasses like his pockets and embroidery, his scroll like a powdered wig. So it all hangs together, the Queen Anne style. Painting, furniture, and silver as well.
If we take this painting by Feek at Harvard, we can see how when he has a group of figures, he presses them all forward to the surface plane of his canvas. Everything is flat and frontal and giving off light. This is a portrait of Isaac Royal and his family, and what a strange family they are. The master of the house is very much aristocratically of the world, but the women have a peculiarly iconic cast, with this strange, rather monstrous child between them. Is this Feek's ineptitude, or does he intend that quality, as Copley surely was to intend his own distortions later? Here, at any rate, is Isaac Royal's house in Medford, Massachusetts, his property, like the child, the women, and the fine Turkey carpet on the table between them. The house, the furniture, the painting itself are all in the American colonial style, flat and plain, linear, luminous, a craftsman's pride.
The furniture had always been more sculptural than the architecture or the painting, and now it becomes more so. These Newport block and shell front desks and chests show that beautifully. They're made to look as if they're carved out of some solid material, some great thick wood or even masonry mass. The blocks bring some of the sections forward
and the shell makes you feel its depth. Most of all, where the shell goes back in a concavity, it has a little edge carved around it, so you feel as if it's been pressed into the wood. So the wood seems to have a real depth. So the whole thing becomes like one great plastic, undulating, Baroque church facade of the kind that's never really built in America. It remains more sculptural and, in a way, more architectural than the buildings themselves. Here in the Van Rensselaer room, we see the Chippendale style, complete with its magnificent wallpaper, the whole creating a generous spatial order inhabited by its creature-like tables and chairs. The style was named for Thomas Chippendale, whose book, The Gentleman and Cabinet Maker's Director of 1754, assembled its elements, which are French, Gothic, and Chinese.
And Chippendale is the most sculptural and the most active of all. If you compare it with Queen Anne chairs, the Chippendale opens up the splat with an explosive gesture that bursts out at the corners. And generally in the colonies, they insist on retaining the cabriole leg that had been characteristic of the Queen Anne. With the ball and claw foot, the quality is all the more that of a crouching creature. And I suppose that Chippendale itself climaxes in this great high chest from Philadelphia, where the sculptural stance is complete. The whole presence is full of animal vitality and burgeoning power. It sprouts decoration. It's a building, a being, and a force of nature, all at once, the ultimate in household gods.
What about painting in relation to all this animal power? Most painters don't participate in it very much. For example, this is a portrait of Jeremiah Platt by John Mayer in the 1760s. And it's still in the tradition of Fique. And though he has his hand on a Chippendale chair in the painting, he doesn't take up space with the same kind of command that the furniture has. In fact, it's John Singleton Copley who first paints portraits which take over space with the same Baroque self-confidence that Chippendale furniture has. This painting by him of Joseph Sherburne is one in which the upper body swells, it turns, and it consumes the space of the canvas. Also, for the first time here, the colonial painter achieves the technical virtuosity that the colonial silversmith and cabinet maker had always had. The painter now is in absolute command of his medium, so that he can create the illusion of this mass in space. You feel it in the painting of that dressing gown, this great possession of this rich merchant. He owns the chair, he owns the dressing gown and the turban, symbols of leisure and success. And he's every way the embodiment in himself, as the furniture had been before, of the complete confidence and control of the craftsman culture. It may also be an American quality that the women can be more formidable than the men. Standing up here close to Copley's Mrs. John Winthrop, I feel that she's looking at me with profound disapproval and is about to say something so sardonic, so intelligent, so penetrating, but so merciless that I never really will quite recover from it. The way she's painted, too, enhances that quality of a formidable presence. She takes her position jammed in between the easy chair behind her with its shiny upholstery and the wonderfully polished hardwood table before her. And her dress gleams with the sheen of silver. And especially her lace is like the fretwork of a silver cup of the same period. At the same time, it's a very American way, because English painting at this time, like the painting of Sir Joshua Reynolds, created forms with a fast, illusionistic brushwork to conjure them up dramatically out of light. But Copley doesn't work that way. He works with hard line, clear plane, sculptural masses. He carves it out of his material and gives it, therefore, a somewhat more primitive, more sculptural, more immediate quality. Mrs. Winthrop is at home in her environment and controls it. You feel that it's an utterly integrated culture. But it's integrated at a certain level, and that's the level of material reality and material possessions. So that if we look at her face, which is wry and sardonic and full of wit, it is unlike much earlier European painters who paint a little bit the way Copley paints now. That is, people like Van Eyck and Memling. Their paintings are full of a kind of spiritual transparency. But Mrs. Winthrop is pure object. She's the limitation and the strength of the materialist tradition.
It's clear that Copley is concentrating on that and draws his strength from it. For example, his Paul Revere in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston is the image of a man who is a silver maker and who holds the precious silver object in one hand while he holds his chin with the other. And the chin and the teapot have the same solid, objective shape. It's as if Revere knows himself, or reality as a whole, by the hand, through the craftsman's touch. And his body, as it's seen here at the table, is truncated and shaped like a pot. He's as pot-like as a teapot. The silvery shine of his shirt is like that of the teapot. Copley is making a person like the furniture, like the silver, like the work of art through which he identifies himself. One thing that's moving, though, is that Copley can do more than that. Sometimes he's awesome. When he paints Sam Adams, also in Boston, pointing toward a document, the dynamism of the gesture is made more intense by the three-dimensional truncation of its beginning in the arm. Its very shortness makes us extend it to the document. But if we compare a Chippendale chair with Adams' face and eyes, that aggressiveness is built into both of them, and Copley catches it in this most uncompromising of the revolutionaries. Another portrait in Boston is that of John Hancock, and Hancock is, after all, only a merchant, and he's holding a ledger which is full of his handwriting, business matters. But very soon, he's going to be the first signer of the Declaration of Independence, and he has enormous handwriting right across the page. So initiating that American idiom, put your Hancock on that. Only a merchant, but Copley has him with his handwriting prophetically, long before he signed. When he says something like, that's big enough for King George to read it without his spectacles.
This is the place where colonial culture ended and the United States began. It's the North Bridge at Concord, Massachusetts. In the morning of April 19th, 1775, the British redcoats who'd marched out of Boston were massed on that side of the bridge. They'd swept the colonials aside with a single volley at Lexington, and now they stood here. The colonial troops were on that hill. They marched down. One of their commanders said, "I don't have a man who's afraid to go." And when they came here to the bridge, the British fired again. The colonials waited, and then the commander, John Buttrick, cried, "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sake, fire." And in that volley, for the first time, the colonials drove the British redcoats from the field. Later, Emerson put it best when he wrote, "By the rude bridge that arched the flood, their flag to April's breeze unfurled, here once the embattled farmers stood and fired the shot heard round the world." And the remarkable thing, from our point of view, is that the man who warned the colonials that the British were coming was that archetypal colonial craftsman, Paul Revere. We've seen his silver and his portrait by Copley. Now, on the night of April 18th, 1775, he had his friend hang the signal lanterns in the tower arch of Old North Church in Boston.
When, in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bonds which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect... The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having a direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. We solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor.
What happens now is the breakup of the colonial culture and the beginning of something new. Copley himself goes to England in 1774, just before the Revolution. Right away, he learned to paint like Reynolds and the others. And he learned how to do it very well, as this portrait by him of Midshipman Augustus Brine shows very clearly. It's so different from the American portraits. Here, there's no distortion at all. There's complete Baroque command of the anatomy. And the subject himself is very un-American. Pink and gold and fresh, as only English children ever seem to be. And very much a sprig of the aristocracy. 12 years old, a midshipman, ordering around people 3 times older than himself in a high, clear voice, with a stormy sky behind him. Copley certainly learned very well to paint in the English aristocratic tradition. But right next to the young midshipman in the Met, there's a painting by Copley, which he'd done 11 years before in America, that makes us think perhaps he really did lose something when he went to England. That he lost a kind of intensity, maybe even he lost a kind of inner knowledge of the colonial culture of which he was a part, as against the England in which, in a way, he was a visitor. It's a portrait of young Daniel Cromwell Verplanck, not a midshipman out in public life already, but a child in the private world of the colonial middle class. And he's here with a squirrel, which Copley liked to paint with children. But in this case, he paints the squirrel's eye and the boy's eye almost the same. So both of them are secret and uncommunicative. And the child's body is like the body of a squirrel, small and bony and all closed in upon itself. And the head is big and crew-cut in the American manner, almost the opposite of the English long hair on the other side. And there's something in this relationship of child and animal that's disquieting and a little monstrous. It communicates a sense of a secret life of childhood. Perhaps especially, and it's going to be very important in the century to come, the secret life of the middle-class child, embedded in the family romance rather than in the actions of public life from a very early age. Reminds one a little bit of Goya, even though Copley's technique is so different. I don't know any other painter of the period who can be so disturbing as Copley is here. It's too bad that Copley couldn't have painted our earliest presidents. In that case, we would have known something about them that we don't know now. But he never returned to America. He died in England, disappointed and old before his time. But all the most hopeful American painters went to England too. And most of them studied with Benjamin West. And they became, like him, advanced European painters. And the special colonial realism disappeared. But not in all cases. Ralph Earl, for example, who, unlike Copley and West, was an obdurate Tory and went to England during the Revolution and studied there and painted for a long time. When he came back to America, his painting resembled the old tradition, and indeed was a good deal like that of Feek.
Earl has some of that preoccupation with pattern and frontal plane that Feek had. And he also has some of Feek's generosity. There's a sort of good feeling that comes out of Earl. The people are big and generous and simple and powerful. And his paintings resemble or perhaps partly inspire a good deal of late 18th and early 19th century folk painting, like this one, where the flat linear patterns in the tradition of Fique are flattened and sharpened even further, so relating to the mainstream of tradition as a kind of countrified version of the American instinct for the flat frontal plane. Earl also seems to paint the new lanky American. His Elijah Boardman reminds us of Fique's Tench Francis, but it has a new kind of sweetness, a new naivete, a kind of openness. There's, of course, a long tradition of full-length portraits that goes back to Velasquez and Van Dyck. But Earl's is an Americanization of it. And again, it's emergent with his goods. And there next to it hangs a portrait of his house. Earl painted quite a few such scenes, which continue the colonial tradition of painting what one owns, but open it out to include the house, the grounds, the whole man-made environment of villages and fields. It's a beautiful document of that kind of architecture that was common over most of America at the time. How quiet and stable it seems, and how subordinate to the buildings the road is. It's the pre-industrial village, ordered in agrarian peace just before the whole world changed. It's still the materialist craftsman culture, but now it's a little more open to the immediate man-made landscape, as if celebrating the peace of the new America. Earl himself, unlike Copley, is painting the heroes of the Revolution after the Revolution, when their heroism has been fulfilled. Marinus Willett is another example of the full-length portrait of the English military type, but now gangling and Americanized. These portraits do indeed have a heroic verticality, which is like the silver that Paul Revere himself was making after the Revolution. His forms, too, become very vertical, with a heroic lift. This urn by him and the hot water pot by Daniel Van Voorhis, both made about 1791, seem to embody a new, rather idealistic aspiration, different from the colonial materialism which had preceded them.
But the fundamental hero is Washington. He is himself the symbol of liberty and is seen as such throughout the world. But in America, he soon becomes semi-divine. He fills some deep need the revolution had opened up. The new Heracles who cleanses the land so that the new society of the United States can begin. And his portraits show us that development from man to God taking place. Moreover, I think we can find a close connection between the way Washington is depicted and the general development of the whole post-colonial style in architecture and furniture as well. This portrait of Washington by Charles Wilson Peale is an early one, and it seems to me that it's a good deal like Earl, though it lacks Earl's sweetness.
Peale is clearly manipulating the figure of Washington to create a sense of height and dominance, and it's a very tough Washington he gives us here, a big, full-bellied general. You can feel a kind of physical brutality in him. He's a cunning, formidable man, a fighter, with a small head and dark, wily eyes.
But that Washington of Peale's rapidly becomes etherealized. And when we get to Gilbert Stuart's Washington, we find him already turning saintly, half free of the flesh, and now with soft, sky blue eyes.
And we see him through the elegant glaze of the English portrait tradition, a film of paint which develops the movement of color through the cheeks, under the surface of the skin, showing the blue haze of the shaved chin and the upper lip. All of it is very elegant, very thin, compared to the sculptural modeling of Copley.
Like painting, the furniture of the post-colonial period is an affair of light, elegant surfaces. with veneers, inlays, and mirrors playing with light on the surface like Stuart's glazes. And the whole piece itself is made to look delicate, almost without mass. It dematerializes. The joints look as if they could hardly hold it up. It's no longer that colonial tradition, a craftsman's tradition of a structural connection and an overall sculptural mass. It has now a new premise. It's based upon a new intention. And this Hepplewhite chair, I think, shows it well. Its pointy little feet hardly touch the ground, and its legs seem to have no structural connection with the seat. But in fact, they're spread wide apart like that in order to focus our attention on the back, where the sides lift up the heraldic shield, in the center of which is the classic urn, and the delicate swags coming back and hanging down along the sides. It's not that it isn't beautifully made, which it is, but it's not based upon a craftsman intention. It's not conceived fundamentally as a physical object, but as an emblematic one. Its intention now is to present the new classical symbol, the symbol of the new republic.
And the same thing happens to architecture. Federal architecture, so-called, tends to get stretched. It gets thinner. It gets higher, exactly like the stretched, taut glazes of the Stuart painting or the furniture.
Here's federal architecture, colonial forms all blown up to serve a new Republican function. Bulfinch's Boston State House, the columns, and the dome. The dome that in Europe belonged to churches. Here, in America now, starting here, the image of the public monument, the temples of democracy, glowing golden in the sun.
And that dome in Boston is wonderful precisely because it's so weightless. It seems as thin as a balloon of air, lifting its little cupola out into space. And the gold takes even more of the weight off it and makes you feel its thinness and again its surface, like the surfaces of Stuart. The next phase of Portraits of Washington, and we might say the climactic phase, is one in which Washington is invested with a new kind of romantic drama and violence. In this portrait of him by Rembrandt Peale, he's set behind a masonry wall of heroically classicizing scale. He's now a classical bust, like that of Andrew Jackson by Hiram Powers, where the ideal conception in blazing white marble is in a kind of tension with the tradition of realism in form, as it had been in Rome itself. Washington is swelling with the desire to be monumental. He's made superhuman, even to the frame, all cannon, swags, and flags, with the American eagle rising over all, the bird of Zeus. He presides over full classical revival furniture as well. It finds its own superhuman scale in grand mirrors and enormous sofas, and in figural pier glasses, like this one by Charles Lanouillet, with its own kind of heroically sculptural form. And of course, that's exactly what happens with the full classical revival, in which houses are monumentalized into temples, becoming even more the centers of ritual for Americans. So, like Rembrandt Peale's Washington, buildings leave thinness in favor of a big sculptural mass, classical order, and the marvelous tread of their Doric colonnades.
The Greek Doric column soon became a fundamental symbol of the new nationalism, the new democracy. Heavy and massive, it was in every way different from colonial forms. It was an image of solidity and permanence, and most of all, a symbol of Greek democracy itself, as here in the New York Customs House. You see them in their full grandeur, on the site where George Washington took the oath as the first president of the United States.
Washington, D.C. is in the tradition of classical authority embodied in France at Versailles. It was Thomas Jefferson who best understood the character of classical architecture, and through him, Washington was planned by a French engineer, Pierre L'Enfant. Across the grid of streets, a upon which Jefferson insisted, run the great radiating avenues. And they originate primarily from the two places of authority, from the White House on one side and the Capitol on the other.
The Capitol building was the focus of L'Enfant's plan, and from 1791 onward, in campaign after campaign of building, it expanded horizontally and vertically to fulfill its functional and most of all its symbolic responsibility as the center of the new nation. Finally, in 1851, in the last of the 19th century campaigns of building, Thomas U. Walter added the two side wings, so that as the country itself had expanded across the continent, so also the Capitol building had expanded laterally across its site here on the top of Capitol Hill. But what was needed now, finally, was a high dome. The older dome was a very low one. But Thomas U. Walter, using cast iron, that is a new industrial material, much lighter and of greater tensile strength than stone, was able to raise that high, taut skin of a dome much higher to the figure of freedom put there when the dome was completed only in 1863. So that all through the darkest days of the Civil War, the dome was incomplete, like an image of the Union itself torn apart. And when it was finally completed, that image of freedom was intended as an inspiration to the Union armies in the darkest days of the war. As with architecture, so with portraiture. Washington must be made larger than life, a monument and a myth. This painting by Leutze, 1851, seems to culminate that whole development. Maybe theatrical in conception, a little academic in execution, but this is one of the places in the Metropolitan where the crowds gather. And I think it's because, as in Washington, he lifts the central group in a dome. You can feel the heroic action gathered together and the diagonal of the rising flag. And I can't help but remind this generation of the raising of the flag on Mount Suribachi, the great photograph out of which the Marine Corps Memorial in Washington was made. In both cases, there is that sense of that archetypal image that we feel in our own bodies of a great lift facing danger and death.
But as the mid-century approached, most American artists embodied their love for America, which was enormous, not so much in the images of its heroes as in the image of its landscape, the image of its place.
The first important painter of the American landscape is Thomas Cole. Cole works in traditions that are already long established before his time. But here in this painting of the oxbow on the Connecticut River at Northampton, he makes an image which is especially American. There is what Fitzgerald was to call the fresh green breast of the New World. And the painter puts himself right down in among its rugged rocks. And across it, a storm is just passing away. And it's carrying with it all the savagery and the wildness of the landscape. While off to the right, a different kind of world is opening up. The world of America as a garden, the gentle, quiet, productive, agrarian world of the 19th century. But most of all, the eye is being carried across it by light, into light, to the light, as if it was traveling across the whole American continent. And that movement into light, into transcendent light in the distance, is going to be the main characteristic of the most important American landscape paintings of the 19th century.
Yet behind Cole lies something deeper, and that's the fundamental model of Claude Lorrain. Claude is the great painter of the reconciliation between men and the earth through the continuity of human culture upon the earth. His figures are quite small, and they merge into landscape through light. It's that kind of organization and idea that Cole inherits, and he has the same instinct. He wants to reconcile the American with the transcendent virtues of his landscape and to preserve it just as it was beginning to be affected by new industrial forces. And out of all this comes the new American domestic architecture of the later 19th century. It's primarily an architecture of wood. The earlier American sheathing had been horizontal clapboards. But in the 1840s, they begin to use vertical board and batten as well. Then that begins to open out into wood-framed porches. These develop more or less from the Gothic portique, fairly heavy, derived from masonry construction. Then it begins to open up. The frame structure becomes more skeletal, lighter, and more voluminous, until finally it develops into the full open pavilion of the American stick style itself. And now here in this house, we come to the fully developed stick style, where it's all wooden construction, and everything expresses the character of the wood frame. The verticals, the horizontals, the diagonal ties, and then up above in the gable, they make the Gothic colonnette en délit in the center, which is normally a compression element. They make it look as if it's under tension, holding the whole thing together. And then when it goes up that wonderful tower, where you have a closed surface, they bring the phantom of the frame forward to the surface, so you have a complete expression of the frame everywhere. And it is a wonderful, tense skeleton, opening out, most of all, framing the sea. And out in the sea is that incomparable light, that New England light of October, the glint of the sun, low down, the gleam of the sun on the sea. That sense of the landscape as containing ultimate good and as preserving the deep past in itself is a kind of corrective for the blatant nationalism which was very strong at this period. It also broke away from that rather simple delight in the self which had been characteristic of 18th century portraiture. Cole's great sequence in the New York Historical Society, his Course of Empire, suggests such correctives because nature alone is the survivor. There's a savage state in human affairs. Then the same site is seen as civilization begins to develop. Then all of it culminates in the same spot, in the gaudy classical revival city, like a dream parody of the cities that Americans were trying to build at the time. It is a precursor of those fevered movie sets of the 20th century which were set up to be destroyed. Then the barbarians break in. finally, only nature is left, now that man has passed away. The whole series looks a lot less fanciful than it might have looked 50 years ago.
One important thing about Course of Empire is that it was commissioned by a patron, Luman Reed, whose portrait here was painted by Asher B. Durand, who was a friend and a follower of Cole. Reed was a self-made man and a grocer, and he was different in a fundamental way from those colonial patrons of Copley's who would pay only for portraits of themselves. That's one reason why Copley and West and the other Americans went to England, so that they could paint pictures on more complicated themes. Now, with the support of men like Reed, they could begin to explore the character of this landscape, the character of human life in the new nation in a wider way. And what they wanted, they and the patrons alike, was a new kind of relationship to the landscape, a new sense of belonging in it, a new sense of deriving some kind of sustenance and courage from it. And most of all, a new sense of belonging to the common memory of all mankind.
This painting by Durand, called Thanatopsis, which means roughly a view of death, best sums up all these attitudes.
The title is from a poem by William Cullen Bryant, a very strange poem for a young man to write, in which he attempts to reconcile mankind to dying by pointing out that the majority of mankind lies dead in the earth, and that when one dies, one goes back, as it were, home to nature and becomes part of it. And the painting is like that. Under the trees, there's a quiet burial ceremony.
Up to the right, magnificent alpine masses loom, and castles of great antiquity rest upon them. But then, down toward the light, again as in the oxbow, goes the lovely garden, out to the transcendence of the distance. And so one is made to feel that in dying, in being put to rest in the earth, there is a great peace, and the earth itself celebrates the grandeur of the coming. And out beyond, in the distance, the light of transcendence flares.
All of that speaks very close to American needs, it seems to me, at any time. For an American who travels to Europe, all of a sudden, there's the realization that there is another attitude toward death than ours, one in which it's more natural, precisely because the fathers for so many generations sleep there. And it's that attempt to reconcile Americans to death, to the common fate of all mankind. It's with that Thanatopsis, the poem and the painting, deal.
To him who in the love of nature holds communion with her visible forms, she speaks a various language. For his gayer hours, she has a voice of gladness and a smile and eloquence of beauty. And she glides into his darker musings with a mild and healing sympathy that steals away their sharpness ere he is aware. When thoughts of the last bitter hour come like a blight over thy spirit, and sad images of the stern agony and shroud and pall and breathless darkness in the narrow house make thee to shudder and grow sick at heart, go forth under the open sky and list to nature's teachings. So live, that when thy summons comes to join the innumerable caravan which moves to that mysterious realm where each shall take his chamber in the silent halls of death, thou go not like the quarry slave at night scourged to his dungeon, but sustained and soothed by an unfaltering trust. Approach thy grave like one who wraps the drapery of his couch about him and lies down to pleasant dreams.
That's what it's about. That's what Americans are trying to find in the continent. They're trying to find that past, those fathers' graves. They'd like to belong here. It's not possession. The furniture doesn't do you that much good in that way. The silver, the great chests, the glossy clothes with the bright buttons on them. In the end, you own nothing. You go back. But you belong to the land you return to. And there's another kind of hope in transcendence.